Right there, well, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to our next lecture on Columba, lecture number 5, Bridei and the Picts. And again, just one or two issues of housekeeping before we begin. There is the summary of the lecture which was on your seats. There are summaries of the previous ones if you don't have it at the back of the room that you can pick up. But then you'll also find on your seat a little initial flyer about our Highland Church History Conference at the end of August. And just commend this to you. If you want to express interest, then fill in your name, address, email, leave it with me, and we'll make sure that you get more information. So we commend this to you very much indeed. Today, in our lecture, we come to Columba and Bridei and the Picts. And in our last few lectures, we've considered Columba in various roles. We've considered him as the Abbott of the Iona Monastery. We've reflected on Columba as the leader of an Irish Celtic Christian community. We've delved into his thinking as a theologian. In particular, we've discovered that the motif of the spiritual battle between Christ and the demonic was a central axiom in Columbas theology. And we've touched upon him as an evangelist, as he carried that Christus Victor, Christ the Triumphant, theology into the mission field. And today we're going to look in detail at what is probably Columba's most famous mission. And this was, of course, his visit to King Bridei of the Picts at Inverness. Generations of school children, of course, have called him King Brood. And various streets in Inverness are named after King Brood. But in modern academic works, the preference is to call him King Bridei. And we will follow suit. The two versions come from, one from Bede, the other from Adomnan. If you read the Latin text of one, it's B-R-U. If you read the Latin text of the other, it's B-R-I. So in modern academics, the preference is to call him King Bridei. So we will bow to that convention. Now, proprietors of bed and breakfast establishments around the Highlands have good reason to bless King Bridei. And this, of course, is because of the story of Columba's visit, and with it was born the legend of the Loch Ness monster. It was in one of Columba's forays up the Great Glen that the first sighting of the so-called monster is deemed to have occurred. Adomnan himself does not use the word monster. He prefers the description of water beast, but it was certainly a fearsome creature. And according to Adomnan, what happened was this, that when Columba was staying for some days in the lands of the Picts, he had to cross the river Ness. And some local people were burying a man, and Columba asked what had happened. The local people told Columba that a water beast had mauled their friend when he was swimming in the river Ness. Columba then asked one of his own men, Moku, to swim across the river and to bring back a boat that was on the far side. Moku obeyed without hesitation, and as Columba anticipated, using Moku as human bait, roused the water beast into action, came to the surface. Adomnan writes that the water beast rushed open-mouthed and with a great roar towards Moku, but Columba raised his holy hand, made the sign of the cross, invoked the name of God, and commanded the water beast to stop. The beast then fled in terror into the dark depths of Loch Ness, where apparently it has stayed ever since. And in this way, one of the fearsome creatures of Celtic and Pictish folklore was vanquished by the blessed man. Now a struggle just as great took place at the gates of King Bridei's fort. A Domnan gives us no firm date for this first meeting, but Bede is more forthcoming. Bede wrote his history around the year 730, and Bede had access to some Pictish sources, and on the basis of information given to Bede from these Pictish sources, Bede writes that Columba met King Bridei in the 9th year of Bridei's reign. Now we know that Bridei came to power around about 554 or 555, and so the 9th year of his reign corresponds to roughly 564. And this was very soon after Columba arrived from Ireland in 563. And what happened was that when Columba arrived at Bridei's fortress, the king closed the gates in Columba's face. And this was most likely a gesture to show who was in control, rather than an absolute refusal to meet Columba. Bridei was king, Columba could wait. And the Domnan writes that Bridei was puffed up with royal pride and acted aloofly. And so the doors of the castle remained stoutly shut, with Columba and his party outside. But dramatically, Columba gained access again when he made the sign of the cross, and the massive doors flew open of their own accord. And according to a Domnan, Bridei was so shocked that he now welcomed Columba gently with words of peace. Now, within a Domnan's narrative, this incident fulfills a powerful symbolic function. It not only symbolises the coming of the Iona mission into the Pictish heartland, it also emphasises that the Iona mission came accompanied by power, signs and wonders. Now, having set the scene, we can now look at Columba's visit to Bridei in more detail, and we're going to do this by asking a series of questions concerning Columba, concerning Bridei, and concerning the Picts. Question 1. Where was Bridei's fortress? Now, William Forbes Skene was the doyen of 19th century Celtic studies. Skene preferred Torveen Hill as a site of Bridei's fortress. And indeed, Pictish ornaments have been discovered at Torveen Hill. And these include, for example, a very beautiful Pictish amulet. However, very few archaeologists today would argue that Torveen was the site of Bridei's castle. Skene also suggested that the area around Crown in Inverness might have been the site, and a smaller and less dramatic mound in Inverness itself, in the grounds of the old High Church, advertises itself as an alternative location. But Craigpatrick fits the description most closely. And the mound at the old High Church may have been a traditional site for Pictish courts of justice, rather than the site of Bridei's fort as such. So Bridei's fortress has most firmly been identified with Craigpatrick, the steep hill on northern outskirts of modern Inverness. Have you all been up Craigpatrick? It's well worth going. I went up for the first time last year, and I was amazed how big the site of the ancient fort is. It's really big, really extensive. So Craigpatrick is far and away the best candidate for a site in northern Pictland as to where Columba came and found Bridei, preferred by almost every scholar today. It's an impressive ancient fort of large dimensions with commanding views over Inverness, the Beauly Firth, the River Ness itself, and access roads and dog walkers' paths provide a route to the top, 250 feet above sea level. And the Domnant seems to preserve a detail of the report that Columba made to his monks back on Iona. In his account, a Domnant writes, "Once, the first time St. Columba climbed the steep path to King Bridei's fortress, the king puffed up with royal pride," etc. And so Domnant stresses that Columba climbed a steep path to King Bridei's fortress. And this steep path certainly corresponds with what Craigpatrick offers. Now, the site has never been fully examined by a professional archaeologist. Minor excavations in 1971 revealed fortifications existing from the 4th century BC through to the 6th century AD. There was also the discovery of a mould for making hanging bowls, indicating that Craigpatrick was a high-status location with contacts to Irish culture. And after the 6th century, and hence after Bridei's reign, the site appears to have been neglected. And that fits in with the centre of the Pictish kingdom moving to southern Pictland almost immediately on King Bridei's death. So these two things match up. Now, if Craigpatrick is indeed where Columba met Bridei, it may not have been his only stronghold or even his main seat of power. It may have been just one of a chain of Pictish fortresses throughout the whole region. Other strongholds like Burghead and Murray would have been under his authority. And similar to later kings, Bridei moved between his string of forts in a royal progress. And this was designed to exert his personal authority, to enable him to keep touch with his people and events within his domains. Presence and visibility reinforce a king's authority. Our second question is, when did Columba visit Bridei? Now, if B is correct, this first visit was in 564 or 565. How many other visits Columba made to Bridei and to the Ness area, we don't know. But it's more than likely that Columba made several visits to such an important king. This was diplomatically necessary. As an aristocrat himself, Columba knew that powerful men do not like to feel that they are being taken for granted. One visit is not enough. Regular contact means respect. And so a Domnant's narrative suggests that Columba made several incursions into Pictland. The 560s date for that initial contact when Conall was king of Dalriata is the generally preferred date, the year after Columba arrived in Dalriata himself. A minority of scholars, and I stress a minority, argue for a post-574 date. 574 is when King Conall dies and the new king of Dalriata, Aidan, comes to the throne. And this minority speculate that Columba only met Bridei after Conall had died and Aidan had succeeded him. W. Douglas Simpson is very clear on a post-574 scenario. In his reading of history, he has Columba rushing off to Pictland to smooth things among the Picts for the new man who has come to the throne. But Simpson's scenario is not really accepted today. The prevailing opinion is that Columba first came around 564 as a subject of King Conall. Conall had ascended the Dalriata throne only a few years beforehand, but he came to that throne when the whole future of his kingdom was under threat. And this brings us to our third question. What was the political context surrounding Columba's visit to King Bridei? Now we recall that Bridei and his Picts had defeated the Scots of Dalriata in battle in 559. It may have been 560. If you go to the Annals of Ulster, they have 560 down. But the trouble is that these dates often have to be adjusted a year either way because of the various changes of calendar since. So around about 559 or 560, King Bridei and the Picts defeated the Scots of Dalriata when King Gabriel was monarch of Dalriata. And defeat at the hands of the Picts was what brought Gabriel's rule to an end and brought Conall himself to the throne. And what Bridei had done in 559 was to nip in the bud any immediate Dalriata expansion into his sphere of influence. Bridei's victory over the Scots did not eradicate them, neither did his victory drive them into the sea and back to Ireland, but it put them in their place. It cowed their ambitions. It showed who was the dominant power in the Highlands. And that was the political context surrounding Columba's first visit to Bridei in either 564 or 565. Bridei had shown his military strength. Bridei was a formidable pagan presence to the north and the northeast of the Dalriata kingdom. Bridei was a man to be reckoned with if the Iona mission was ever to get off the ground. And Bridei was a man to be pacified if the Dalriata kingdom itself was to survive. Now the latter, of course, is the context which Ian Finlay majors on in his book on Columba. And Ian Finlay's book on Columba, to my mind, is one of the very best. And there is a copy available in the bookshop in Dingwall High Street this very day. I saw on the shelves earlier. Finlay sees Columba's whole reason for going to Dalriata as driven by the aim of propping up a Christian kingdom which was under severe pressure from the Picts. And in Finlay's view, Columba left Ireland and arrived in Dalriata with the express purpose of ensuring that the Christian kingdom in Dalriata survived politically and spiritually. So he sees Columba coming to Dalriata specifically to deal with the Pictish threat. And Columba knew that the threat from Bridei and his Picts had to be neutralised. And Dalriata could never defeat Bridei on the battlefield, so it had to be by diplomacy. As a high-born aristocrat, Columba had status and diplomatic skills. As a churchman, he also had spiritual ambitions. And if in the course of diplomacy, Bridei and the Picts were evangelized and converted, so much the better. And so in Finlay's analysis, it is imperative that Columba makes contact with Bridei as soon as possible. Now, of course, Finlay may be wrong. Negotiating Dalriata's future security may not have been Columba's primary aim when he left Ireland. Other factors, as we've seen, may have made him leave. But certainly as soon as he arrived in Dalriata, he would become aware of the precarious position the kingdom was in. And it's more than likely that Columbus soon realised there was a work to be done. A diplomatic work had to be done, as well as a spiritual work had to be done, if the Christian kingdom of Dalriata were to survive. This brings us to another question. Who were the Picts? Answering this, of course, could be a whole series of lectures in themselves. In summary, from the time of the Roman Empire's incursions into Scotland and until the formation of a new kingdom of Alba in the 9th century, the Picts were a powerful presence in Scotland. The name Pict is said to come from the description given of them by the Romans. The Romans called them the Picti, or the painted people. Now, Picti, of course, is a Latin term, so did the Picts describe themselves in Latin? Of course not. But the suggestion is that by coincidence, the Picts' own word for themselves, whatever that was, sounded like the Latin Picti, the painted ones, which fitted the actual physical description. Now, Pictish studies are a lively field of contemporary research among Scottish historians, and part of this reinvigoration is because of Professor Alec Wolfe of St Andrews University. 10 years ago, he advanced the theory that the major Pictish centre of Fortrui was not situated in the south in Strathearn, but much further north in our area, in the Murray area. Now, William Skene and generations of scholars beforehand had assumed that Fortria was in southern Pictland, and that was where the heartland of Pictland was, but that thinking is now quite rapidly being discarded. And Wolfe's hypothesis has rapidly become the standard model in Pictish studies. And Wolfe's reinterpretation has introduced a new energy to Pictish studies, especially in the north of Scotland. Kings of the Picts are sometimes called kings of Fortrui, and this repositioning of Fortrui in the north rather than in the south has domino effect ramifications. And Wolfe argues that Pictland was a loose hegemony centred on the northern kingdom. And in Columba's era, even Orkney was within Bridei's power, perhaps also Skye, possibly the whole Outer Hebrides was within the northern Pictish kingdom. Our next question, question 5. Were the Picts one nation or many nations? Again, the old view was that there were two main Pictish kingdoms, the northern and the southern Picts. The old view was also that these two kingdoms were quite distinct, with their boundaries roughly delineated by the Grampian Mountains, the Cairngorm Mountains, separating the southern Highlands from northern Scotland. More recent thinking plays down the separateness of the northern and the southern Picts, but in any case, both groupings were collections of quasi-independent groups or tribes, each with their own leader and their own king. But through time, powerful figures began to exercise more extensive influence over these scattered, isolated groups. And one of these figures was, of course, King Bridei. After Breide's death, Pictland became even more a cohesive unit, although its political centre then shifted to the south, corresponding with what the archaeology already found at Craigpatrick, and also corresponding to a shift in Columbus' own mission after Bridei's death, focusing his activities around Loch. And this is probably why the Amra Columcille, the praise poem written only a year after Columbus' death, mentions his activities around Loch, but doesn't mention his activities further north. Eventually, of course, there was the 9th century amalgamation of Dalriada Atta and Pictland into the new nation of Alba, and then in the fullness of time, first Strathclyde and then Bernicia, including the Borders and Galloway, were absorbed into Greater Alba, and the modern nation of Scotland took shape. But that's many years in the future. The next question we have is an interesting question. What is Bede's version of the story? What is Bede's version of the story of Columba meeting Bridei? Bede, writing his history around 730, is given the following information from Pictish sources. And Bede writes, Columba arrived in Pictland in the 9th year of the reign of the powerful Pictish king, Bridei, son of Melchocon. He converted that people to the faith of Christ by his preaching and his example. End quote. Now, modern scholars are of the opinion that Bede was given a version of history in which the Picts of his day wanted to highlight Columba's impact upon them. By Bede's time, the early 8th century, the Picts by and large were Christian. And so the Picts of his time wanted to represent their forebears as having responded positively to Columba's preaching. And so Bede's account gives the impression that almost as soon as Columba came to the Picts, there was a mass conversion. This, in one sense, was the new official Pictish church history, which the Christian Picts of the early 8th century wanted Bede to record about the late 6th century. But yet, as we mentioned before, in Adomnan's life of Columba, which preserves the actual Iona tradition, there is little trace of such a triumphant outcome to Columba's evangelism in Pictland, apart from a few individual families. And this tension between what we can glean from Adomnan's account and what is stated quite boldly in Bede's account is one of the interesting areas of the whole encounter. Our next question, question 7. Who was King Bridei? Bridei was the powerful king of the northern Picts, ruling from around 555 to around 584. Of all the men in Scotland at that time north of the Forth Clyde division, Bede was unquestionably the main player. There were other kings, but Bridei was the main man. Bede terms him Rex Potentissimus, or the most powerful king. To the southwest, he had defeated the Scots around 559, ending the reign of Gabrain and Dalriata. To the north, his power extended to Orkney. Adomnan records that a sub-king of Orkney was present at Brede's court as a hostage. Skye was well within his orbit. It may be that Lewis, Harris, and the whole of the Long Isle was also subject to him through his considerable naval power. Just as the kings of Dalriata had fleets, Bridei also had ships at his disposal. He had power on both land and sea. And from Craigpatrick and the other centres, Bridei held sway over vast tracts of the Scottish mainland and islands. With power came wealth. Bridei was a prosperous man, and one of Adomnan's stories features him owning luxury items. And this comes in a story in which Columba is near Brede's fort but not in it. And despite not being in the fort, Columba is able supernaturally to know that a glass cup held by Bridei's druid has been shattered into fragments by an angel even as the druid was drinking from it. Now the story reveals that Bridei and the Picts owned glass drinking vessels. A glass object was a high status object, most likely imported from the continent, perhaps from as far south as the Mediterranean. And the ownership of luxury goods, such as glass bowls from distant lands, was an indicator of tremendous relative wealth amongst high-status individuals, both among the Scots and among the Picts. And for several centuries, there has been a vibrant trade around the coast of the British Isles with fragments of amphorae jars, manufactured in the warm countries of the Mediterranean, being found at sites both in Ireland and up the coast of Britain. Where did Bede himself come from? Was he by birth a northern Pict, or was he a southern Pict who gained control of the north as well? Alan Bruford argues that Bede's description keeps either option open. Bridei could have been a king of the northern Picts who became the over-king of the southern Pictland, or he could have been from the southern Picts who conquered the north, created a dual kingdom, and set up a headquarters near the river Ness, from which to supervise the pacification and the resettlement of the whole province by land and sea. It's impossible to establish certainty, and huge theories can be built on either hypothesis. Our next question is this. What did Bridei already know about Christianity? Was Bridei aware of Christianity before his encounter with Columba in 564 or 565? It's almost certain that Bridei knew about the faith that Columba represented even before Columba arrived at his gates. A powerful man like Bridei was well informed. He had to be. Any major political leader had to be in the know. Information is a currency of power. Bridei would be aware of the religion of Dalriata. He'd been at war with them just a few years earlier. He was probably aware of the great movement of Christianization which had taken place in Ireland. Bridei would certainly be aware of pre-Columba missionary activity in various regions of Pictland, especially southern Pictland. Now, this is something we've not had time to look into or discuss. Before Columba arrived in Pictland, other Irish Celtic missionaries had already been there. Men like Moluig of Lismore, plus many others. And there is one tradition that teaches that Bridei had met Moluig before he met Columba, and preferred Moluig. And so Columba was not coming to totally virgin territory as far as evangelism was concerned. And this is why the likes of James E. Fraser of Edinburgh, now back in Guelph, why he argues for a relatively extensive evangelization of Pictland from the south before Columba arrived on the scene. But certainly it would seem that Bridei would know all about this. Douglas Simpson has no doubt. In Simpson's final edition of his book, The Historical Columba, which isn't really very historical, written in the 1960s, he claims an even more extensive pre-Columban Christianization of Pictland. Simpson concludes that the majority of Pictland was virtually a Christian realm by the time Iona started its belated but highly publicized activities. Now today, in academic circles, Simpson's exaggerated vision of a heavily pre-Columban Christianized Pictland is not supported. But a more modest, but yet important intrusion of Christian faith pre-Columba is assumed. And so even on that basis, there is little doubt that Bridei would be well aware of Christianity. So the man who arrived outside the closed gates of his Inverness fortress was a man whose faith Bridei was already aware of. That brings us to our next question. What were Columba's aims? Gaining access to such a powerful man as Bridei was never going to be straightforward. The arrogant slamming the gates of the fort in Columba's face showed Bridei's egotism. And yet the gates did open, but in what capacity did Columba come? Was Columba simply an ambassador for Christ? Was Columba also a political envoy from Dalriata? Did Columba come to secure protection for Iona monks working within Pictland? Did Columba come to secure a truce between Connell and Bridei? Did Columba come as an evangelist? Or did Columba come with an eye on existing Christian communities already scattered throughout Pictland? Was his real spiritual aim one of reforming existing pre-Columba Christian communities in the Highlands in line with Iona principles? Was that his aim, rather than straightforward pioneer mission as such? And that certainly is James E. Fraser's favoured view. Or did Columba come because, as a power figure himself, he revelled in contacts with the makers and the shakers of his day? Could he simply not resist going to see what Bridei was like? Was it that Columba's personality meant he had to meet the biggest power figure of them all, Bridei of the Picts? He couldn't resist contact with important men. Answers are not easy to arrive at, When we read Bede, Bede emphasises pioneer evangelism and preaching. When we read Domnan, Domnan seems to stress in his preface that Columba came as one who taught monasteries how to live properly. Ian Finlay suggests that whatever the reason for Columba's journey, he arrived at Bridei's fort by prior arrangement. Finlay argues it would have been totally foolhardy for a small group to set out from Dalriata up the Great Glen to the Pictish stronghold. Here we have northern Scotland, here we have Iona. This is a journey that Columba would take, and then arriving at Inverness. Now it's true that much of that journey up the Great Glen would be by water, but the party could have been ambushed by local tribesmen at any point. Irish monks were not lacking in courage, but neither were they averse to risk-taking. But Finlay reckons it was an almost suicidal mission, if not made without some prior agreement with Bridei himself. And if that reasoning is correct, and if Columba came through prior agreement, then there were certainly political aims alongside any spiritual aims. It's unlikely that King Bridei would make safe conduct arrangements simply because he wanted to hear about another religion. It is highly likely Bridei was interested in some kind of understanding with Conall of Dalriata. Yes, he had defeated the Scots a few years earlier, but he would want that to be signed and sealed. There was no danger on his southern flank. And so consequently, as part of this understanding, Bridei may have tolerated evangelism. Bridei was a tough political realist. His desire for a strategic settlement with Dalriata may have been the trigger for Columba and his party journeying up the Great Glen to Bridei's base on the Ness. And so if Columba came by appointment, why were the gates slammed in his face? Slamming the gates of his castle in the face of agreed envoys doesn't, however, I think, contradict the view that Columba may have come by agreement. For example, in Westminster Parliament today, we have the ritual slamming the door by the House of Commons in the face of Black Rod, who comes from the House of Lords. Isn't that right? But that ritual event does not contradict the fact that the two houses have a prior agreement as to how they relate to each other. And so slamming the gates and slamming the door is a declaration as to where power lies. It does not signify a refusal to meet or a refusal to do business. It's a statement of power, not a policy of rejection. But having made such a big statement, Bridei is doubly confounded when a higher power trumps his own. And when the gates are opened not by his say-so, but by something beyond his control. Now both Alan Macquarie of Glasgow and Ian Finlay stress the probable political objectives behind Columba's visits to Brood. And for Columba, the work of the kingdom of God required both evangelism and the security of Dalriata. And Columba would not see these as separate things. And yet Domnan doesn't inform us directly what Columba's aims were in meeting Bridei. Question 10. There's only a few more questions. What happened when Columba met Bridei? Now we can look in detail at Domnan's actual record of the meetings that took place between Columba and Bridei. Domnan refers to Bridei by name 5 times in his life of Columba. Book 1, Chapter 1, Bridei is mentioned simply to give context for a miracle story. Columba takes a white stone from a river and blesses it so that it may work a cure. And the Domnan writes, this miracle of God happened in the sight of King Bridei and his household. So Bridei is simply mentioned in the context of giving a reference for the story. Story 2, Book 1, Chapter 37. Bridei is mentioned again to give the setting for a story about the power of Columba singing. Domnan tells us that the event happens near the fort of King Bridei. Bridei's druids try to stop Columba and his monks saying Vespers lest the heathen people would hear the sound of God's praise from the brethren. Columba's voice is miraculously lifted up in the air like some terrible thunder, so that the king and his people are filled with unbearable fear. Story 3, Book 2, Chapter 33. This story is about Columba pleading for the release of an Irish slave girl. Columba is in Bridei's house, in the presence of the king. He is unsuccessfully pleading for the release of an Irish slave girl. She had been captured during a Pictish raid against Al-Dalriata, and slave trading was common in the culture of the time. Columba's pleading has no effect until he takes drastic action, and by the power of God, Columba brings Bridei's druid Broichin to the point of death. This makes Bridei relent through fear, and he sets the slave girl free. Echoes of Moses in the court of Pharaoh. Broichin is a symbol of pagan influence over Bridei, and Columba's encounters with Broichin, the druid, constitute the centre of the spiritual warfare at Bridei's capital. Story number 4, Book 2, Chapter 35 again. This is the classic story of the gates of Bridei's fortress opening when Columba makes the sign of the cross and puts his hand to the door to knock. And then lastly, the 5th story, Book 2, Chapter 42, Adomnan gives us a long, complicated story. Columba asks Bridei to give protection to the monk Cormac, who is seeking a place of retreat on the ocean. And Cormac is a monk described elsewhere by Columba as a truly holy man. And Columba is said to be a monk who no fewer than 3 times laboured on the ocean in search of a place of retreat, yet found none. And so Cormac is evidently looking for an uninhabited island on which to live as a hermit. But there are so many Celtic monks looking for the same thing that Cormac can't find the spare island. And there's a possibility that Cormac might wash up on Orkney. Now, Bridei is the overlord of Orkney, and so Columba persuades Bridei to use his influence to ensure Cormac's safety if he arrives there. Adomnan adds, quote, "Thanks to the saint's commendation, Cormac was delivered from imminent death in the Orkneys." End quote. So these are the 5 times Bridei is mentioned in Adomnan's life of Columba. This takes us to another question. Did Columba preach the gospel to Bridei? So did Columba preach the gospel as we would traditionally understand that activity to take place? In a sense, nothing in the 5 references we've looked at corresponds to the traditional image we may have in our minds of missionary preaching. There is no record of Columba standing before Bridei explaining the message of the cross, the resurrection, the coming judgment, and a call to repentance. So do we even know if at their meetings Columba ever informed Bridei of the nature of the Christian message? If Columba explained the faith, this has to be inferred. Adomnan does not make it explicit. And so at first glance, this seems to support James Fraser's insistence that Columba was not so much a missionary or an evangelist in the conventional sense. However, it may be that such a conclusion would misread Adomnan. It's true that Adomnan does not record Columba explaining the gospel to Bridei in the way Billy Graham might explain the gospel. Adomnan does not even record Columba teaching the gospel to Bridei in the same way as he explained the gospel to Emma of Glen Urquhart and to the old man of Skye. But here I think we have to note a few points. Now, one argument is that we do not have direct examples of Columba preaching the gospel to Bridei because Columba was unsuccessful in that. In the Iona tradition, Bridei himself did not convert. And therefore some argue, because our Domnant only cites examples of Columba's successes, he does not record him preaching to Bridei because Bridei did not convert. The argument is that a Domnant does not record failure, he only records success. Bridei did not convert, and so a Domnant does not record unfruitful preaching. So that is one argument. But we would suggest a deeper examination. We have to understand the notion of gospel proclamation from the Irish Celtic mindset, not our own. And that mindset, as we saw last week, the triumph of Christ over his enemies is paramount. And with this in mind, I think we can underline three things. First, a Domnant's aim is to present Columba as a man of God clothed with power from on high. And so what a Domnant focuses on are Columba's triumphs over the powers of evil in Bridei's territories. And the reader is to understand that these victories over the demonic are themselves manifestations of the triumph of the cross and the scattering of the enemies of God. Related to this, for a Domnant, the gospel is proclaimed when the power of the true God and the victory of Christ over the demonic is made manifest. Christ is proclaimed, the gospel is made known in these triumphs of spiritual power. And so in one sense, a Domnant would be a little bit perplexed by the question, have you recorded Columba preaching the gospel? A Domnant would say, but I've written about the power of God evident in the triumph of Christ over the demonic. And for a Domnant, that would be equivalent to preaching the gospel. Early accounts of evangelism in the Irish Celtic Church, or indeed in the Roman Church, do not give us sermons about the gospel such as we might expect today. Rather, they give us accounts of the triumph of Christ in setting the demonic to flight, and in this way bringing home the claims of the true God to the listeners. Because this Christ sets the demonic to flight, the true God has a claim in your life. Do you yield to these claims? And so for a Domnant, what he has listed happening is the proclamation of the gospel, because it's the exaltation of Christ. This takes us to another question, question 12. Did Bridei become a Christian? Now the only source that might imply Bridei became a Christian is Bede's history. But even Bede does not say so explicitly. Bede simply says, quote, Columba arrived in Pictland in the 9th year of the reign of the powerful Pictish king Bridei. He converted that people to the faith of Christ by his preaching and example. Now, elsewhere in Bede's history, when he's talking about the gospel coming from the south of England through the Roman Church up through various tribes, Bede chronicles individual kings being converted. But he does not, in this narrative, explicitly say that Bridei was. Bede records that the Pictish people were converted, but he does not explicitly include the king. Now, elsewhere in his history, Bede has examples of a king allowing his people to convert, even though the king himself does not convert. For example, in Kent, and then the kingdoms to the north of that, the king gives his permission for the gospel to be heard by his people, even though he himself may stay back from that, even for a time. And so we have to be cautious. It's almost certain that Bridei himself did not become a Christian. There is no statement in a Domnant's life of Columba that Bridei ever adopted Christian faith. Ian Finlay points out that in none of Columba's visits to Pictland do we read of gifts of land or the founding of churches and settlements that formed the pattern of conversion in Ireland. We're not told that the king gave this land or that land. It has to be assumed that if such an important king had been one for the gospel, then the tradition at Iona would not only have preserved that information, but would have celebrated it. Domnall records the conversion of two obscure families, one in Glen Urquhart, no offence to folk that live in Glen Urquhart, the other in Skye. He would surely have recorded the conversion of the king, the most powerful king in the whole of the Highlands. And so in Domnall, and therefore in the Iona tradition which Domnall represents, there is no record of Bridei being a trophy of the gospel. And what we do find in Domnall is Columba exerting influence over Bridei by persuasion. And part of the power of Columba's persuasiveness comes from the mighty works he is able to perform. He's like a latter-day Moses in the courts of Pharaoh. The consequence is that for all of Bridei's reign and for many years afterwards, the Iona monks have unrestricted freedom within Pictland. There is no recorded persecution of Christian monks in Pictland until the massacre of the monks of Egg around the year 617. That was well after Bridei, and that was probably due to local tensions in the Egg locality, the island of Egg itself. And so the evangelization of Pictland does not bring with it a story of martyrdom. The Iona monks are permitted to do their work, and many would see that as being one of the greatest fruits of Columba's contact with Bridei, or maybe of Maluig's contact with Bridei, if one prefers that narrative. In the closing moments, can I just come back to the monk Cormac, the strange case of the wandering monk. Here we refer to the incident when Bridei agrees to protect the monk Cormac, who is wandering on a trackless ocean, ever searching for a special place of retreat. What's that all about? Is it simply about the monk Cormac looking for a hermit's island? Or might be there more under the surface? And here we note a few points. First, when Columba spoke on Cormac's behalf to King Bridei, there was also present an under-king of the Orkneys, a ruler subordinate to Bridei. This under-king of the Orkneys was staying as a hostage at Bridei's fort. Bridei was ensuring the loyalty of Orkney by keeping the local king under close guard. And this was a regular custom at the time and for many centuries afterwards. But also, when the conversation took place was probably on a later occasion than Columba's first visit. If, as we think, Columba made several visits to Bridei, then after the first in 564 or 565, when Conall was king of Dalriata, there was more, and this particular incident may have occurred after King Aidan came to the throne of Dalriata in 574. King Conall was a relatively timid king. Conall wanted peace and security for Dalriata after the heavy defeat to the Picts in 559. King Aidan, who came to the throne in 574, and we'll hear more about him next week, was totally different. Aidan was confident, belligerent, expansionist, bellicose. And so, for example, the Annals of Ulster for 580 and 581 record an expedition to the Orkney Islands by Aidan of Dalriata as part of a military campaign on his part. Now, what did that mean? Was Aidan testing Bridei's strength on his northern boundaries as the king got older? And certainly a combination of the Annals of Ulster and Domnall's life of Columba indicate that both Bridei and Aidan had an interest in Orkney at that point. And if so, were the discussions about the monk Cormac really related to Aidan trespassing in Bridei's Pictish waters? Was Columba concerned that Aidan's aggressive actions might bring reprisals on any Iona monk who came ashore in the far Orkneys? Or indeed was Columba involved in political negotiation between Dalriata and Pictland in relation to Orkney and felt this as an opportunity to plead Cormac's case? Was Bridei defending Orkney against an aggression by Aidan and a resurgent Dalriata? Was there an alliance between the two kings? Was Columba sent to Bridei to act as a negotiator? As Richard Sharp in his introduction points out, guesswork is free but unprofitable. What we do know is that Columba was in a unique position of having access to both the king of Dalriata and the most powerful king of Picts. And he may well have been involved in high power diplomacy. Final slide, final question. What did Columba achieve with Bridei? According to Ian Finlay, the main thing is that Columba gained the security of Dalriata. The threatened kingdom could now rest, be at peace. Columba's politics and faith were inseparable. For Columba, whatever advanced the kingdom of God was linked in with evangelism. The security of the Christian kingdom of Dalriata was bound in with that inseparably for Columba. Columba would appear to have neutralised the military threat of Bridei and the Picts. And after Columba's negotiations, missionary monks from Iona appear to have total security within the whole of Pictland. After Bridei's death, the centre of Pictland moves to southern Pictland, to the Loch area. As I said, that is reflected in the Amra Columcille that speaks of Columba being an apostle to the fierce ones of the Tay. After Columba's death in the next century, we have a vast Christianization with King Gartin of Tayside, and then the whole of Christianization of Pictland takes off. And even somebody like James E. Fraser acknowledges that by the end of the next century, virtually the whole of the north of Scotland had been Christianized. And along with that, of course, is linked in the recent discoveries at Port Mahommed and the Pictish monastery at Port Mahommed. For again, we have no time to look at in these particular lectures. So next week, Columba and the new king of Dalriata, the belligerent, the bellicose, the aggressive King Edom.